Ross Hunt, pollster and founder of Hunt Research in Dallas. Thank you again for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Jack.
So we're speaking on the day before Election Day. Now we have all of the numbers that have come in for the early vote in Texas. And the Texas Secretary of State says nearly 9.1 million Texans have cast a ballot early, which
That's
is
right.
about 49% of registered voters. So talk to me a little bit, because that's lower than 2020, which was COVID, where we had, it was a totally different time, but higher than 2016 than all of the people who voted in the presidential election that year. So talk to me a little bit about all that.
That's right, Jack. Yeah. So voter registration has risen in Texas between the last two presidential cycles. So in 2020, there were just under 17 million registered voters in Texas. Now there are over 18 million. And so naturally, we'd expect more votes to be cast. The vote total, as the Secretary of State has right now, is 9,060,035, which is 93% of the votes that were cast in the 2020 election through early voting. But voter turnout as a percentage of registered voters is 8.5% lower than it was then. And almost all of those losses in terms of turnout come from mail ballot voting. So the amount of votes, the raw votes that have been cast in person across the state of Texas through early voting is actually almost exactly the same as what we saw in 2020. But the change is all in the mail ballots. Many more people were voting by mail ballot in 2020. And the mail ballots have come in at numbers 2/3 lower than they did in the 2020 election. And that's really what's driving lower turnout in 2024.
And why are we seeing this?
Well, a part of it does have to do with the COVID year. We had a lot of special election provisions in 2020. We had 3 whole weeks of early voting in person, which encouraged a lot of people to vote early. And also, a lot of people had anxiety about COVID-19 and voted by mail. Many of the senior citizens who can vote by mail elected to do that. So those are some of the differences, are just mechanistic differences. From the standpoint of analyzing the vote, what we're seeing is that Republicans, that is, people who have a history of voting in Republican primaries and those who live at their households, are turning out in much higher numbers relative to Democrats in this election than we've seen before. Republicans and independents are basically tracking even with the turnout that they had in 2020. But Democrats have fallen off, at least so far, have not turned out to vote early in the numbers that you would expect on the basis of 2020.
And why do you suspect this is happening?
Well, you can't know for certain without having a crystal ball or the ability to sort of read people's minds. But some of the trends that we are seeing in turnout are quite instructive. The youth vote in particular is very interesting. So if you look at voters under 50, and so sort of a brief sort of some positive news for those of us who are at the median age. If you're under 50, you are a young voter relative to the rest of the electorate. Young voters who have Democratic primary history are turning out at only about 4/5 of their voting strength relative to 2020. Whereas those who are Republican primary voters who do not participate in party primaries are turning out at or above their 2020 levels. So that suggests to me that younger Democratic voters are not motivated to turn out in the state of Texas, or at least they haven't been motivated yet.
And what we did see on Friday was a big day in Dallas County. They had more than 74,000 people vote in person.
That's right.
But their average is still below the state average. It's not even 45%, and the state is nearly 49%.
That's
So,
right. Yeah, the state of the county of Dallas is at 44.93% turnout. At the end of early voting in 2020, it was almost 56% turnout.
so what does
So
this
100.
So it says what? That because Dallas is so Democratic, they would need to really overperform on election day.
They would have to turn out a lot of extra votes. I mean, they're down 121,000 votes relative to 2020. And that's hurting, I think, Democrats' chances statewide, certainly. I mean, if we look, for instance, at the U.S. Senate race, Colin Allred, who's challenging Senator Ted Cruz, hails from Dallas. He was originally a congressman here in North Dallas. And if we look at his home congressional district, that district is it's turning out it's turning out 32nd worst out of the 38 districts in the state of Texas right now. Meaning that if you look at how it voted in 2020 versus how it's voting now at the end of early voting, it's way down. And so that is characteristic of urban and Democratic heavy districts all around the state. And it presents a challenge to Colin Allred and also to Vice President Harris when it comes to the statewide vote in Texas.
How surprising is that this is his congressional district? And I know he's not on the ballot in that district, but he's on the ballot in the Senate race.
Yeah, it's not something that anyone inside the Allred campaign, I think, is particularly happy about. But it really is just a symptom of the broader pattern of low Democratic turnout and low urban turnout around the state of Texas. Texas is a state with a lot of people moving in. It's a state with a lot of big cities, a lot of rural towns, and also a lot of growing exurbs. And one of the divides that we're seeing, Jack, as we look at turnout throughout early voting, is that the urban areas and the suburban areas are turning out at levels below 2020. And the exurbs, the rural areas, but also the small towns and the small communities cropping up on the outskirts of all of our large cities are all turning out at or above their 2020 levels. And some of that has to do with partisanship, but some of it is also just that these areas, these outside of the urban center areas, seem to be very energized this year.
And I wanted to ask you about, from time to time, we in the political reporter class have been talking about the poll differences in Texas. When you look at the Real Clear Politics average of polls, former President Donald Trump leads Vice President Kamala Harris by about 7 percentage points. And if you look at Senator Cruz, his lead over Congressman Allred is 4 percentage points. So we've all been asking, who is this Trump voter who's not voting for Cruz? And we've heard anecdotes from people that, yes, Allred is getting some Trump voters. And I'm wondering, when you look at the data, what does this suggest to you?
I think it's possible Allred. You're always going to have both campaigns get a little bit of the other side's voters. I think in the data that I've been seeing, that gap has been diminishing as we've moved through the election cycle. So, several months ago, when Allred first started campaigning against Cruz, we saw a much wider gap between Trump and Senator Cruz. And it was driven by a couple of things. There were some moderate Republicans who were dissatisfied with Cruz and didn't really know Allred. And there were also just a lot of lower propensity voters, general election only voters, who hadn't really looked into the Senate race at all. And they were for Trump because they were concerned about issues they thought they trusted Trump on more, like the border and inflation, but they hadn't thought about the Senate race. Since Senator Cruz began attacking Colin Allred on various aspects of his record, we've seen that gap narrow considerably. And so I think that the number of voters who are going to be casting a split vote for Trump and for Allred might actually be lower than a lot of people expect, especially in North Texas, because intuitively one might expect there to be a lot of split voting in North Texas because there are more moderates. Like in North Texas, you have a lot of moderate voters in the suburbs, but we're also seeing, like in South Texas, a massive surge of support for Trump among voters who are not traditionally Republican. And so there we actually may see more split ticketing there, but it might come in the form of a dramatic surge for Trump as opposed to Republicans defecting to Allred.
And let's talk about Tarrant County, because Tarrant County is above the state average in turnout. But
that's right.
Does that necessarily mean that Republicans have the advantage there? Because what we saw in 2018 was Cruz lost Tarrant County to Beto O'Rourke. And in 2020, we saw President Trump lose to Joe Biden in Tarrant County, even though they both won the state. So I'm wondering, when you look at the data, what do you believe is happening this year?
Yeah, so this year, Tarrant County, like many urban counties, is down in turnout relative to 2020, 10 percentage points lower in turnout, 71,000 raw votes. It's voted at about 9/10 of its 2020 strength. But it's voting more Republican than it was in 2020. By my calculations, using statistical analysis, but also just looking at the partisanship, party primary history of those who have voted, it is about 6%, excuse me, about 2% more Republican this year in terms of turnout than it was previously. If you look at the composition of those who voted in Tarrant so far by their party primary history, a full 40% are Republican primary voters. Only 28% are Democratic primary voters. Now, if we flash back to 2024, at the end of early voting, 39% were Republican and 30% were Democratic. And I think that that puts us in a position where you could see President Trump carry Tarrant County in 2024.
And what about Cruz?
Cruz also has the potential to carry Tarrant County in 2024. I think that's possible. A lot of this does, of course, come down to another big question on people's minds, which is election day turnout. We have a lot of Democrats who have not voted. Many of them are people who have voted in every single election since they could vote. And those folks are almost certainly coming out to vote. There are also many Democratic voters who are younger, who are busier, who are perhaps not as satisfied with their options at the top of the ticket. And many of those voters may stay home on election day. And there's still a lot of Republicans left to vote. In 2020, because of the long duration of the early voting period and the prevalence of mail ballot voting, very few votes were actually cast on election day. In fact, only 14% or less of votes were cast on election day in 2020. That's a very low number. Normally, about a third of votes are cast on election day. So the big question for President Trump's campaign here in Texas, but especially for Senator Cruz's campaign and all the campaigns down the ballot, is which way will that turnout skew? How much will Republicans surge on election day, and how many of the Democrats will come out, and how many will stay home?
And as far as the Collin and Denton counties, you don't expect those to flip, or do you?
I do not expect them to flip. No, I mean, if we look at the margins in those counties in 2020, so in 2020, Collin County was about 8% Republican, and Denton County was 11 to 12% Republican.
You're
So
talking
those
margin of victory, right?
that's right. If we look at that's taking the average of Senator Cornyn's Senate race and then President Trump's presidential race. And that's a lot of votes to swing in a single year. And the other thing is that both of those counties, like many counties around the state, are turning out more Republican than they did in 2020. It's not as dramatic as it was in Tarrant County. In Collin and Denton, by my calculations, the vote is about 1 to 1.5% more Republican. So those are counties where they're what are called purple counties. They're heavily suburban counties with voters with a wide range of political opinions. But those, if anything, they're trending just a little bit more Republican in 2024 than they were in 2020.
In Collin and Denton counties.
That's right.
And Tarrant County too, from what you said.
Yeah, in Tarrant County it's a similar story across the state. There are a few exceptions statewide, but it's true of the major urban counties. It's true especially of the counties farther south along the border, all the way from El Paso to San Antonio to Laredo. We're seeing lower turnout, significantly lower turnout among Democratic partisans, and significantly higher turnout among Republicans and independents. And as Texas, part of the sort of the future of Texas will depend upon how the various political parties appeal to the rising electorate of Tejano voters in the South. And so I think one of the things for us to watch, we think, of course, about DFW, but thinking about the future of the state as overall, one of the places I'm going to be watching most closely is the border on election night.
And my last question to you, and I appreciate all your time, and that is, how many Texans do you believe will have voted total? I mean, because 11.1 million, maybe close to 11.2 million people voted in the 2020 presidential election in Texas. Do you suppose that this year we're going to top that?
I think that total voter turnout as a percentage of registered voters is going to be lower in 2024 than it was in 2020. We would have to see an absolutely massive election day surge to break the percentage turnout number. It is possible if we have a high turnout election day that we could see as many as 12 million total votes cast in this election. I think the most likely scenario is that we end up with turnout that is right at the 2020 number of 11.1, possibly a little higher, but with, of course, a slightly greater skew to election day.
So essentially a record number of ballots cast, but a lower percentage of registered voters because there are more of them now than 4 years ago.
That's right. Yeah. And we're still running numbers on this. I mean, I'm running a model that will allow me to crunch this for election night, and I expect I'll have a more precise prediction. But I think the most likely scenario is that we break the total votes cast number and come up a little short on turnout.
All right, Ross Hunt, pollster and founder of Hunt Research in Dallas. Thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Jack. Have a good afternoon.
You too.